We have become so overwhelmed by the volume of games released every year that it can be difficult to recognize a game's true value. The right game, in the right hands, or at the right time, can be a treasure more valuable than can be measured with money or expressed with words. It can be an experience that changes one's perceptions or their opinions, and by extension, even their life. TUNIC released on March 16, 2022 and received a smattering of comparisons to The Legend of Zelda and favorable critical reception. It is the culmination of a lifetime of gaming experience and nearly a decade-long development cycle by Andrew Shouldice and a handful of his very talented friends. It was brought to life through persistence and iteration, but it was fueled by insatiable curiosity and a love for discovery. But just what is TUNIC? Is it really just an imitation of Zelda, or is there something else to it? And if so, just what exactly is that something else? Upon the release of Dark Souls, I mused that the game was a reflection of what the Zelda franchise could have become if, say, it had grown up with its original audience. It has been over a decade since then, and both franchises have released multiple titles. But I still believe that there is some truth to that statement. So it came to my great surprise when, during my journey with TUNIC, I realized that the very same thing could be said of this game. For some reasons, the same as Dark Souls, but for some reasons that were very different. In simple terms, Dark Souls is kind of like Zelda, but with the combat difficulty cranked up to 11. By contrast, TUNIC is kind of like Zelda, but with the puzzle difficulty cranked up to 11. The problem I have with this analogy is that it's not just an oversimplification, it's also not very accurate. Yes, you have a sword and a shield. Yes, you are on a quest in a beautiful but hostile world. But the truth is that TUNIC shares just as much of its DNA with games like Dark Souls as it does with Zelda. Not to mention the fact that it has a whole host of other traits that distinguish it from these monoliths of gaming. TUNIC should stand on its own among them, but I would argue that the game has suffered a bit in establishing its identity in general, in that it was introduced to the world and audience as, it's like Zelda, but. It's like Zelda, but you're a fox. It's like Zelda, but cute. It's like Zelda, but indie. It's like an indie Zelda, but you're a cute fox. I know that was my first impression, and I know now that was, frankly, wrong. TUNIC deserves so much more than to be relegated to the categories of the games that inspired it. Not that there are anything wrong with those games. The Zelda and Soulsborne games sit at the very tippy top of the list of my favorite game franchises. With each new release, I am transported into their immersive, evocative, and thoughtfully crafted worlds, and filled with the very same sense of joy and wonder that I experienced upon my first visits to them when I was just a kid. Feelings that seem harder and harder to come by with each passing year, but I digress. The point is that Zelda and FromSoft are a core part of my DNA. Not just as a gamer, but as a person, and I say that without an ounce of hyperbole. Playing The Legend of Zelda is literally the very first memory I have of my time in this world, and it has absolutely played a role in shaping the person that I am today. Now, I understand why TUNIC would want to market itself as being similar to Zelda. The similarities are there, especially on a surface level. Simple screenshots and brief gameplay snippets allude to some of the same concepts that Zelda is famous for, and hey, if you're gonna be compared to something else, why not the GOAT? Especially when you're just an unknown indie game and the first independent release from the developer. It just made sense as a way for TUNIC to try and get its furry little paw in the door. It needed to find some way to get into the homes of gamers, but once it made its way into mine, I realized that TUNIC is no mere Zelda clone. It is something truly special. It is a challenging, cerebral, and immediately iconic experience that deserves to be honored with a description of what it is, and not just what it's like. So, for that reason, starting now, I will be deconstructing every aspect of Tunic that makes it what it is, while doing my very best to avoid referencing the Zelda franchise. But yeah, it's like if Dark Souls and Zelda had a baby, and then Full Metal Furies and Hyper Light Drifter had a baby, and then those two babies grew up and knocked boots to the sweet, sweet sounds of lo-fi and chill. And then that baby grew up to become a game design genius who released a game about a fox. Okay, but seriously, no more Zelda references. Starting now. For real. For real, for real. Story? What story? Nah, I'm kidding. There's a story. But early on, there really appears to be almost no story at all, except the slight hint that it may be the old save the princess trope. After making enough progress to start becoming exposed to the miasma, there seems to be an implication that this world may have a dark history. And as the clues pile up, each reveal is a tantalizing morsel of new information. What happened here, and what exactly is the main character doing about it? And as for that quote-unquote princess, well, they're definitely not what they seem. While Tunic may be an adventure, it is not a story about adventure or an adventurer, and it does not feel like one. The fox, known in the world's lore as a ruin seeker, is certainly not expected to become a hero, and anything they do that may be considered heroic is merely circumstantial. They do not have a training arc, they do not seek justice or power or revenge. Their real treasure is not the friends they made along the way. Their tale includes almost no aspects of the literary hero's journey. Instead of being character-driven, the plot of Tunic is much more about its world and the ideologies that led to its current disposition. It doesn't necessarily break new ground in the ideas it puts forth, but it reveals them in a way that has real tension and a legitimate emotional impact. Even though the story never really feels like it exists for the benefit of the player, it does make it feel more genuine. The story exists because it does. The plot does deal with concepts that could certainly encourage the player to be reflective or even introspective, and there was definitely a time in one of the game's latter areas where the game took a bit of a dark turn and the reveal had me say out loud, "What?" Which is actually really impressive for a game with virtually no dialogue, if you think about it. A much later moment in the game, I was beaming with a smile that reached from ear to ear as I delighted in the lighthearted and heartwarming moment I was allowed to witness, due in no small part to the fact that I had to earn the right to do so. This, like all of the story moments, has a feeling of authenticity that is difficult to put into words. I didn't feel like a member of the cast, but I also didn't feel like an audience member. It was more akin to overhearing someone's phone conversation or seeing a situation between loved ones play out at the airport. Tunic may not be a story-driven game, but it definitely does the most it can with what it has and delivers some surprisingly strong moments. The visual style is somewhat minimalist, but this doesn't prevent it from having a strong presence. In fact, the graphics have a lot of personality and beauty. There are many traditional geometric shapes in the designs, in everything from the trees and bushes to even the UI and the game world's written language. It's a pleasing and consistent aesthetic that helps unify the game world and establish its identity. Combining this theme with a vibrant color palette and soft, rounded edges prevent the visuals from feeling like cold hard math. The results speak for themselves. The world of Tunic is beautiful and the art is warm and inviting. It's almost Ghibli-esque, not in a technical sense, but in spirit. It has a certain charm to it that evokes a sense of childlike wonder. The animation lends its aid here as well. The character, the enemies, and the environment all sell that same cartoon-like style. Looking at the character in motion, we can see plumes of dust that kick up when they roll, or the exasperation being expressed when they're hopping around out of stamina. and it's adorable. This graphical style does create a rather striking juxtaposition to the gameplay, but of course, we'll come back to that later. The isometric view seems like a throwback to a previous era, and in some ways it is, but like everything else in Tunic, it serves a purpose. And I do mean everything. Take, for example, the dust plumes I just mentioned. Those are shown during the window of the character's roll animation when they have invincibility frames. There's also the fact that the fox will turn its head and look on at nouns of interest even if the player cannot see them. You see, there is nothing arbitrary about Tunic, and that includes the camera. The entire experience, including all of the mini battles, shortcuts, and secrets, are designed around the player's exact advantage. This is a deliberate choice made by the developer, and not only is it a core part of the gameplay loop, it is possibly even a part of the lore. The player is intended to see everything exactly as it is shown, and not necessarily how the character would see it. Tunic, played from any other angle, would simply not be the same. I will admit that hiding stuff off camera is a bit cheesy, and in general I'm not a huge fan of this concept in games, but because it is incorporated as part of Tunic's core design principles and because it is clearly taught to the player very early on, it's pretty cool. In other words, while I don't necessarily love the idea itself, it is done just about as well as it possibly could be. Enough for me to not only accept it, but even enjoy it, even if begrudgingly. Another thing worth mentioning is that the potential of the isometric view is fully realized in the game's map design. The game world is fairly large, especially by indie standards, and even more so when considering how densely packed each area is with meaningful content. It makes excellent use of its space, which means the player doesn't have to waste significant portions of time on traversal. There are also ample shortcuts and multiple ways to access key areas. It's abundantly clear that each section of the game has been iterated upon countless times until achieving near perfection, and it really shows. The map design really is just about perfect. The soundtrack in Tunic is ethereal, but it is also goal-oriented, and that goal is simple: to accentuate the game's emotion. There are no grandiose orchestras, no bombastic compositions, no sweeping melodies crying out of adventure. Instead, the music is ambient and subtle. It's surreal, most certainly, but at the same time, contemplative. It is also painfully difficult to describe. It would be easier to explain how the music feels than what it sounds like. So let's enjoy a sample. It's almost like the music is trying to speak to me, and while I may not understand its language, there is no mistaking the very real and complex emotion being conveyed, and those feelings are as nuanced as they are significant. The masters behind Tunic's music can make someone feel happy or sad, sure, but they can also do both of those things at the same time. They also had a strong grasp on more fleeting emotions. Playfulness, eagerness, and inquisitiveness one moment, and then, just as easily, confusion, apprehension, and isolation in the next. Paradoxically, the music helps fill the narrative void while also complementing it. A resolution to the melody is always just around the corner, but like a distant memory that remains just out of reach, it never comes. It's like trying to recall a dream upon waking. The details are fuzzy, but the joy and the sorrow are real. Ultimately, the sound design and the game design work in tandem, subtly encouraging the player not just to observe and absorb, but to ruminate. TUNIC actually begins by jumping immediately into the game, giving the player control of the fox and a path forward. But before the player has even had a chance to locate their starting equipment and begin to learn the moveset, the questions have already begun. What am I doing here, and where am I supposed to be going? What is this structure for? What does this sign say? Wait, what does the menu say? Just what exactly have I gotten myself into? But initial progress is easy enough, and the questions float to the back of the mind. For now, there are enemies to fight and areas to explore, and surely answers will come in time. Seek out and ring some random bells? Wait, isn't that how Dark Souls starts? Before long, the player will come to understand that combat, while familiar and somewhat simple, is precisely crafted and intentionally challenging. Death finds its way to the player easily, and if they can't find their way back to where they died, they will be penalized some of the game's currency. Wait, isn't this how Dark Souls starts? Indeed. For me, and I imagine for many gamers, that first night playing TUNIC was very similar to the first night with games like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring. And by that I mean a little bit of hard-earned progress and a lot of death. A lot of death. The combat may start out rather difficult, but that difficulty actually diminishes fairly quickly. As the player gains a better understanding of the game and its systems, the battles, even the ones against bosses, become substantially easier. At the same time, the other main aspect of the game begins to showcase more of itself, and starts ratcheting up the difficulty outside of combat. So, what part of the game is more challenging than the one that can offer death? Some might call it exploration, some might call it progression. Some may call it the game's puzzles, and it is in fact all of these things. But to be more precise, I would call it knowing, or more specifically, not knowing. Not knowing where to go, not knowing what to do next, or why it even needs to be done. Recognizing that there are patterns and clues that point in a specific direction, but not being sure what to expect when getting there. There is always this feeling of being a stranger in a strange land, because, even after the knowing, there is still yet something to see. Understanding. What Tunic does when it shifts from being a combat-focused experience is demonstrate an absolute masterclass of pacing. Every new morsel of information comes at what feels like exactly the right time and leads to just enough new insight that progression feels not only worthwhile, but earned. What new items are and what they do is often ambiguous, game mechanics are intentionally obscured, and the goals for the player, as well as the character, remain nebulous. Just about every discovery is made through intuition, trial and error, or sometimes, albeit rarely, plain accident. At its peak, Tunic hopes to guide the player from revelation to revelation and achieve a certain form of gaming nirvana. The biggest clues are drip-fed to the player via collectible pages of a manual, scattered throughout the world like a trail of breadcrumbs leading to, well, to something. But what? The thing is, nearly every time one puzzle is solved, it is revealed that that was just one step in solving an even larger puzzle. The mystery is shrouded in mysteries, which are shrouded in mysteries. Everything is cryptic, but the beautiful, dare I say even magical, part of Tunic is that the ability to solve the next mystery is always there. The developer absolutely mastered the art of hiding things in plain sight, and the onus is on the player to use the information available to them and find new meaning in it. For example, it took me entirely too long to find this room, and then it took me entirely too long to even figure out that the only point of it was to change the fox's appearance. For a more practical example, it took me a little too long to figure out how the upgrade system works, and that's part of the reason why that boss repeatedly destroyed me in the earlier part of this segment. Oh, and here's a fun one. I literally ran away from the shopkeeper the first time I saw them. Tunic revels in the unknown. I have no major complaints, but it would be disingenuous for me to imply that Tunic is flawless. Most notably, there is definitely some of the physics jank that should be expected from any 3D indie game, and usually in regards to collision detection. There were also a handful of other very minor annoyances, such as when slaying enemies. Their corpses don't always disappear right away, and the corpses can block the player's follow-up attacks on other nearby enemies. There's also the fact that currency dropped by slain enemies magnetizes to the character immediately when they're defeated, but any dropped mana doesn't appear until after the corpse has disappeared, and does not magnetize to the fox from nearly the same distance as the currency does. This was probably a deliberate design choice, but did it have to be? There was also one glitch I experienced that at first seemed to be an extreme oversight. One of the key items I had collected for story progression had disappeared from my inventory and, upon checking, had in fact returned to the place in the world where I collected it from. However, this was merely a visual glitch. The state of the world and use case for the item were not affected whatsoever. It was a case of something seeming much worse than it actually was, which turned out to be fairly inconsequential. There were also some very minor visual glitches, and one time I managed to soft lock myself by dashing into some geometry that I wasn't able to dash back out of. No deal breakers here, but for the sake of transparency, these seemed like things that were at least worth mentioning. At the end of the day, every game has to choose what it wants to be, and just as importantly, what it does not want to be. No game can do or be everything at once, no matter how much Fortnite and Roblox keep trying, and generally speaking, the more that a game tries to do, the less it will achieve overall excellence. It's not a complicated concept. The more moving pieces something has, the more possible points of failure it will also have. What Tunic has done far better than most games is hone in on exactly what it wants to be, and this makes for a very finely tuned experience. But, more importantly, it has also chosen to strategically sacrifice its potential for replayability to enhance its initial experience. There are other games that have done this, of course, especially ones that are heavily invested in their narrative. What makes Tunic special is that it isn't just its story, but its gameplay can only ever be experienced as the designers intended, just the one time. It is for this reason that the deconstruction of its gameplay in this video remains necessarily brief and somewhat vague. It is abundantly clear that the game values its secrets, and to allude to them any further would be to diminish the very essence of what makes it such a special game to begin with. But what I can say definitively is this: The benefit to this approach to game design, especially when executed properly, is impossible to quantify. Slowly making my way through the game's mysteries, discovering its secrets, answering its questions, and finally making my way to the intended ending is one of the most fulfilling, meaningful, satisfying, and memorable gaming experiences that I've ever had. Tunic doesn't need to have replayability. It will live rent-free in my head for the rest of my life. So I have to say sorry to Braid. You had a good long run, but you have been officially demoted to my second favorite indie game of all time. I feel the need to express that Tunic has been carefully crafted so that it can be accessed by even the most casual of players. It does not take a genius to work out its secrets, but it will absolutely make you feel like one when you do. It just takes a little bit of time, attention to detail, and the willingness to stick with it. Have faith in yourself, and I promise that the game will not let you fail. For reference, my first time seeing the credits roll was at about the 12-hour mark, but my full completion required the better part of 30 hours. I spent nearly an entire evening making almost no progress at all because I overlooked, or rather misunderstood, the biggest clue that I needed to advance. The cadence of the game changes dramatically around the halfway point, where combat drops off almost entirely to focus on puzzle solving and narrative. Whether or not it could be improved by better balancing the aspects of its first and second halves is debatable, and I suspect highly dependent upon the player. This initially bothered me, but in retrospect, I wouldn't change it. I think it works best this way. The transition from a more combat-focused experience to a more neurological one is handled carefully. Still, I do wish there were more boss battles in total. Even just one more would have given the game the ability to end in a way that was a bit more climactic. Something worth mentioning is that even after achieving the game's intended ending, many mysteries still linger and many discoveries can still be made. However, there will be no further reward for the player beyond the simple satisfaction of doing so. There is no equipment to be found, no new bosses to fight, no super secret endings, at least not that we know of. The puzzles at this point exist only for their own sake and do not serve a tangible purpose. The only revelation for the player is learning what they are capable of. An open challenge, if you will, to any willing players to test their mettle against the ingenious machinations of the game's developers. Personally, I tapped out around the time I concluded that I would have to decipher Tunic's in-game language to make any further progress. I believe this is where the game truly actually ends, and anything beyond that is superfluous, at least in terms of the video game, but maybe that's the beauty of it. People can choose when their time with Tunic has come to an end. And for me, yeah, it was cracking a written language that was clearly more than just a simple cipher. A writer I may be, but a linguistics expert I am certainly not. To be clear, it's not at all required to decrypt Tunic's script to see all that the game intends to offer, but also, there are still yet more mysteries to unravel and puzzles to solve if one feels so inclined. Perhaps the single most impressive part of Tunic is the duality with which it exists. It is a true gamer's game, but it could just as easily be someone's first game, and it would still be accessible and still be special. Imagine feeling nostalgia for something you've never experienced, like some kind of nostalgia deja vu cocktail. Yes, it is an homage to a handful of greats that clearly helped to inspire it, but it is also a deep expression of itself and the unique experience it has to offer. In other words, it's not just inspired by one of the greats, it's one of them. And in my eyes, it always will be. The combat is difficult to start, but the game's true difficulty and its soul lies in how it challenges the player to seek not only knowledge, but understanding, and ultimately, wisdom. By the end of my time with Tunic, I'd been analyzing saved screenshots, drawing out diagrams in Photoshop, and working through some of the game's most challenging brainbusters with a friend I was streaming my progress to in Discord. The gaming industry has no shortage of truly brilliant minds, from absolute legends like Shigeru Miyamoto and Hidetaka Miyazaki to community heroes like Jeff Kaplan and Naoki Yoshi-P Yoshida, to indie stars like Toby Fox and Jonathan Blow. Not to mention all of the hundreds or thousands of other geniuses hard at work writing code, innovating new design techniques, crafting new development tools, and countless other less glamorous jobs that continue to push the industry forward. Andrew Shouldice, the designer of TUNIC, has every right to be counted among them. It is extremely impressive how every aspect of TUNIC is united on all fronts. Every individual part of the game contributes to its themes and its identity. It isn't just that the graphics, the music, the story, and the game design are all excellent, it's that they're all striving for the same very specific goals, with each individual aspect coalescing into a beautiful singularity. This idea cascades from the very game itself to its various deconstructed parts and all the way down to its minutiae. But what makes TUNIC genuinely amazing is how the overall design of the game is a direct reflection of the gameplay itself. Each piece of the puzzle comes together to form, yes, a solved puzzle, but also just one piece of an even bigger puzzle. The commitment to this very simple idea and its stellar execution are truly astonishing and, well, inspiring. Even though I am not a game designer, I hope to someday be able to create something, anything, as thoroughly realized as TUNIC. It may not be the kind of game that will mean something to everyone, but it is the kind of game that will mean everything to someone. A common sentiment in entertainment media is the desire to delete something from one's memory just to be able to experience it like new again. TUNIC is an exemplary game befitting this notion. I truly lament the fact that I will never again be able to experience TUNIC for the first time. I can only take solace in the fact that my time with the game has given me the ineffable confidence to encourage others to seek its experience. Hey, you. If you haven't played TUNIC, maybe you should give it a try.